Greetings and welcome to the 2021 Maryland State Firemen's Convention and Educational Sessions. In the presentation, Are We Really Operating Safe Fire Apparatus? I'm Alan Baldwin. I'm the Assistant Chief of Operations for the Stafford County Fire and Rescue Department. And with me is Tom Shan. Tom?
Tom Shan from Winchester, Virginia, a senior partner in emergency vehicle response. Chief Baldwin and I are very pleased to be able to present this program to you, kind of reviewing a little bit of history of the apparatus and where we are today.
Get a little bit about my background. As I said, I'm currently the Assistant Chief of Operations for Stafford County, Virginia. Over 40 years of service with Fire and EMS, and 20 years as a Senior Command Officer, originally from Pennsylvania. And again, a great opportunity and privilege to be presenting to you today. Thank you.
My background started in College Park Fire Department in Prince George's County, Maryland in 1970. I had the pleasure of working in the apparatus industry for 28 plus years. Been very blessed to be able to support Navy and Marine Corps fire and emergency services, assisting them with their apparatus fleet specifications and procurement system. And together with my partner, Mike Wilbur, retired lieutenant from FDNY, have authored the Apparatus Architect articles in Firehouse for the past 20 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about just overall apparatus design, different concepts and things to think about, whether you're in the process of buying a new rig or getting out on the apparatus floor to check out to see, kind of review your units and what kind of condition they might be in. So here's some of the bullet points of what Chief Baldwin and I are going to try to cover here in the next 90 minutes or so. First overall comment, your apparatus design really impacts a lot of things of how you operate, not only in the training but on the fire ground. So the physical weight, the size, your staffing models, surfaces that you're going to use to ascend to get into the rig in different areas, and if you happen to have an aerial device, the vertical and horizontal reach, depending upon who made your unit, is going to have a lot of impact as to how you operate on the fire ground. Second bullet might be a little bit startling to folks, but I can assure you from Chief Baldwin and my experience between the two of us, as you can see it combined almost 80 years of experience, requiring a new apparatus in multiple areas in your specs that it meets the minimum requirements of NFPA 1901 does not ensure that the vehicle is safe, and even if it is, you can still be put in an unsafe condition depending upon how you operate it. Most important, that you want to make sure that your organization, if you're doing it locally within your jurisdiction or at a larger county level, you need to specify mission-capable apparatus that will enable you to meet your life cycle expectations on the unit. Finally, the cost of new apparatus. Historically, fire apparatus have increased in cost about 3 to 4% each year. Starting in 2005 with the EPA requirements and changes in the diesel emission and the particulate products that come out of the exhaust system, apparatus between 2005 and 2010 increased probably 8 to 10%. And as a result of the pandemic, a lot of the apparatus component parts that we're using are exceedingly difficult to get with supply chain issues, so that the overall cost of your unit, as you're going to see here shortly, in some cases has outpaced our ability to be able to fund it. So a little Maryland theme, back in the day. All right, if we roll back 40 or 50 years ago, just about every department at some point operated with a commercial chassis apparatus. As you'll see, the unit, the tilt model cab Ford, which was utilized extensively, that particular unit from Bryan's Road, Maryland, and the Ford F model that you can see that was operated at one point by Ocean City. Those units were low, short, everything on it was mechanical, and even if you didn't have a lot of fleet experience, it was generally a backyard mechanic. So fire apparatus back in the day, if we roll back 40 or 50 years ago, just about every department at some point in their history operated with a commercial chassis fire apparatus. As you can see here in the picture, the tilt cab Ford was extremely popular and was utilized by a lot of different apparatus manufacturers. That particular unit from Bryan's Road ran for many years. And then similarly, the short wheelbase Ford Pierce bumper that you see from Ocean City, these units were common in our apparatus fleets. Rockville Fire Department, which was the patron home of MAC for many years. You can see it was one of the 4 R models that were utilized by the department, and they worked so well that several of those were rebuilt. The unit from District Heights, Station 26 back in the day in Prince George's County, open cab fire apparatus was extremely common. Even though the units were equipped with jump seats, it was still fairly common for the brothers and sisters to ride on the back step. Switching up from engines to trucks, they again were largely open cab to afford better visibility as you got into the block. And as you can see, the mid-mount ladder, it was from Riverdale, Company 7 in PG County, with a 100-foot Maxim ladder, and then the Berwyn Heights tractor-drawn ladder. That particular unit was unique in that it had seating for 6 on the tractor, and as delivered was originally equipped with a booster pump and tank. So long before we thought that Quints were the way to go on aerial apparatus, they were in fact used in a number of areas. Unfortunately, Maryland wasn't known nationally for having a lot of fire truck innovations, but these are 2 that Chief Baldwin and I have come up with. Way before 4-door cab apparatus became mandated by NFPA in 1991, the Pikesville Fire Department in Baltimore County had purchased a pair of 4-door cab MAC pumpers as shown on the left, and Frostburg, Maryland had a rather unique low-profile Seagrave rear mount that had forward-facing jump seats, or what was the term utilized extensively in Maryland, buckets. So they were enabled to ride 6 people seated and have 5 people all masked up, ready to go once they arrived. On a national level, New York City Fire Department has gone through a number of evolutions over the years, and their 4-door cab apparatus first appeared in 1972. Which again, if you think about it, the 1901 requirements didn't mandate the 4-door cab apparatus until 1991, and because of the impact of urban disturbances and the war years, during the summer months, as you can see, engine 209 got to be too hot. It was well before we had air conditioned, or we called it climate control, because we didn't want to admit that as firefighters we needed air conditioning. They would remove the doors off, and as you can see, the window was removed as well, so that the ambient heat coming off the MAC motor would enable the 6-person crew to still arrive there in some degree of comfort. The MAC aerial scope, the 75-foot tower ladder, really revolutionized fireground operations in New York, and that particular design is still used extensively here over 50 years later.
You know, Tom, looking at some of the changes in the slides, go back to the 2 truck companies from Maryland, thinking back to where we've come in 50 years, at least, apparatus period, talking about the cabs, the FD&Y examples, the days of cramming 6 or 8 people in a ladder truck and hanging on to the rails on the turntable as opposed to getting everybody inside, the things we used to do to today, and some of the changes, some of the things even in the future is going to hold for us with some of these items.
Yeah, to go back to Chief Baldwin's comment, so New York City Apparatus-Back in the day ran 6 people on an engine and ran 7 people on ladder companies. That kind of staffing just about doesn't exist anywhere anymore. So one of the more innovative departments rolling back to the 70s was the city of Syracuse, which developed a mini-maxi concept by having a 2-piece engine company to allow the mini pumper to go out and handle the smaller incidents, still leaving the engine back in quarters with a reduced staff, but enabled to respond to other calls and to take the wear and tear off the big units. While the city current units don't have firefighting capability, they still run them out on first response calls and enable, again, to reduce the wear and tear on the other units. The image on the right is something that was developed between the city of Syracuse and Fire Research Company, where the chief of the department, Chief Thomas Hanlon III, worked with the late Jack McLaughlin to be able to develop a radio-controlled pump with a hand transmitter that as each attack line came off, the nozzleman would have that in his pocket and be able to control remotely from inside the building the operation of the valves on the pumper to be able to send the water. So back in the day, if you go back to that C-Series Ford, as you can see on the right, number of the dimensions. It was a short wheelbase, was 26 feet in overall length. Today we sometimes have difficulty getting our engines under 30 foot of overall length. 35,000 pounds was the total weight of that vehicle, with a 12,000 pound front and a 23,000 pound rear. By comparison, if you have a single axle Quint that you were going to purchase today, you would need that 35,000 pound rating just to hold up the rear axle on the vehicle. 500 gallon water tank. It had a Caterpillar engine that had 225 horsepower. Again, if we have our utility trucks or brush trucks have larger horsepower outputs than that. A very, very short dimension from the front of the cab to the center line so you could get it anywhere. And we had a big, deep rear step because we were still riding folks on the back step. A more modern version, all right, slightly larger. Now the unit is just under 34 foot of overall length. It's 54,000 pound GVW because we want to put more water on it with a 1,000 gallon tank. We've got a 500 horsepower, and in an effort to keep the unit short, what we've done, because now bumpers have become extended, we've taken that dimension and reduced the rear step. So then in a lot of cases, that rear step isn't something even that you can safely stand on when you're going to rack and attack line.
One of the things about, from an operational standpoint, Tom, where you're going with all this too, is to look at, bigger is not always better. You need to know your first due area and base the apparatus needs on that area. And again, something we're going to discuss a little later on. But again, it's important not just to get in that trap that bigger is better. Make sure you're speccing your apparatus and designing it for your first due area and your needs.
If you look at with access to social media today, that people, whether it's on a Facebook platform or the manufacturer's website, you can look at a vehicle and it might look like it's going to work well. And one of my taglines, Chief, is that every fire truck I ever designed fit on an 11 by 17 piece of paper. It looked good on paper. When you go there in the final inspection and go to tape it, and in many cases, and just initially working with apparatus committees where they're replacing a 15 to 20-year-old vehicle that was a modest size, and because they kind of think that this is the physical size of the vehicle that we need, I've done nothing any more sophisticated than taking a tape measure and chalk, and we chalked that out on the apparatus room floor and said, this is how much bigger your vehicle's going to be. So some people can conceptualize that on a blueprint. Other people would say, well, 26 feet is okay, and 33 or 34 doesn't fit. I actually heard one member say, well, as long as it fits the firehouse, it's going to work. Well, it's going to look good if it sits in the firehouse. It might look real good in the Memorial or Labor Day parade running straight down your main street in town in a parade formation. Might not get around the first due response area very well.
Well, the same thought, if you're chiseling out the floor in the station or cutting into the overhead on the door to get the apparatus in the base, that's probably a sign we've gone someplace maybe we shouldn't have.
Yeah, I've always mentioned it to a lot of departments because we want to get out in front of the public, have these very nice electronic signs out in front of the station that will advertise an upcoming event or public service event or a fire prevention related event. If somebody buys a vehicle that doesn't work, too big, too high, whatever, can't get anybody to drive it, I've never seen the electronic sign say, we bought this and now we're sorry. You know, if your life cycle is even say 15 years, it's unlike, you know, leasing a car that at the end of 36 months, if you didn't like it, you didn't have any intention of buying it, you turn it back in and you walk away and say, well, I'm a better educated customer right now. If you're buying a fire truck for 15 or 20 years and you make a mistake, you're kind of stuck with it. So, little cost comparison. Back in the day when I started, you look at the cost of a pumper at $45,000, a ladder truck at $80,000, and the most expensive vehicle at that point was a tower, a rear mount tower, and that ran over $100,000. Today's cost, a pumper on a custom chassis, you're in the area between $750,000 to $800,000. You look at the cost of aerial devices, and I honestly thought, Chief, that when engines got to be in the 6 to 650 range, and when ladder trucks got to be over $1 million, there'd be like a timeout and just say we need to reassess where we're going. When you look at those costs, and incrementally they're only going to get more expensive. If you take that pumper at $750,000 and plan on running it, say, 15 years, where you're going to run it 10 years frontline and 5 years as a reserve or a spare, and then add to that the incremental cost of maintenance, fuel, all of the testing requirements, and you start prorating that and look at what's your annualized cost of ownership here. In a lot of cases, even in larger communities, it's outpaced the ability to be able to fund it. Even if you have a really good, you have the Bank of Fort Knox in the basement of your station, it's going to get to be very difficult, particularly if you need to go out in front of the public and ask for this funding. Those costs are getting to be the point that in many communities, and certainly the case in smaller, modest-sized communities, if you even buy a pumper, right, that's the most expensive 6-tire vehicle that community owns. You can buy any kind of other moving equipment where the chief and I originally came from in Pennsylvania, me in upstate New York. You can buy a fully loaded snowplow with stainless steel everything and state-of-the-art electronic technology, and that's going to cost $250,000 to $275,000. When you go in front of your municipal financial folks and tell them you need $800,000 to buy a fire truck, you have to have a pretty good reason to be able to do it and justify that expense, and just can't go out and say, well, we need it and here's why.
And a big part of that is planning and predicting too. When we talk about the financing, some of the projects that Tom, you and I have been involved in, or myself personally, is having that apparatus plan, that financing plan, but also having it flexible enough to realize the changes in the economy. Some of the discussions that we had earlier this morning about even supply and demand with materials costs are coming up, being realistic with those projections and making sure we're planning for it and we keep a funding stream available so we don't get into that situation behind the 8 ball.
Exactly, Chief. You say there's very few fire departments that the chief and I have ever gone into and said, do you have an apparatus fleet replacement plan? And everybody will say yes, and they say, well, how long do you want them to last? For whatever reason, the most common response back is, well, we're looking to get 20 years out of it, a combination of frontline and spare service. And you look at the age of the vehicles and you look at the average age, you go, well, your average age of your frontline engines is 22 years, so I guess we're not replacing them at 20. And then folks will come back and say, well, that's what we'd like to do, but we don't have the money to do it. Well, if you have an apparatus fleet replacement plan, you have to have the funding stream behind it. So that goes to the first bullet point. We want to have a planned service life, a combination of frontline and reserve service. In today's modern fire service, particularly in the county departments, a reserve unit is really somewhat of a misnomer. It's an additional unit that on any given day, it's at a station somewhere filling in for a unit that's out of service, for training, for warranty, or routine preventative maintenance. So the old, as Chief Baldwin and I, at one point we were both worked for ISO in the public protection area, the old school ratio of in-service to reserve units used to be 5 to 1 for pumpers and like 6 or 7 to 1 for ladder trucks. That just frankly doesn't work, folks, anymore. And if you are operating in the smaller department outside of a countywide fire service, where you have a special service unit like a truck or a squad or a tanker, and that's the only one in your station and the next one's 10 or 15 miles away, the day that goes out of service, you're no longer a fully functional department. That part of your operation is now out of service for some reason, and you need to be able to plan for that.
And one of the things when we talk about reserves is realizing that reserve apparatus needs to be as equally capable and ready for service as the front line piece is, because it's going to fill in at any given time for a short period or long period of time. You just can't be reserve status because it's the oldest piece in the department. We don't want to put a lot of money in it, but we're saying it's there. It has to be able to function 24/7, 365.
On point, Chief, and the other thing that in talking to a lot of larger city departments, there's a big difference between, say, an in-service reserve and a straight reserve. In many jurisdictions, a reserve unit is exactly that. It kind of looks like your frontline unit, but it has no equipment on it. So the day that your frontline unit goes out of service and you need to, quote, swap out into the reserve, In some cases, that's a 3 or 4 hour extravaganza, racking the lines, putting all the equipment over, as compared to in some jurisdictions where you have an equip reserve and the only thing you're switching over are radios and maybe SCBAs and a thermal imaging camera and a few of the higher expense items like that. That again is a cost of ownership, but ultimately impacts your service delivery capability out to the people in your response area. So there's a couple of different areas, things to consider, right? We have the planned service life on paper. This is how long we would like the unit to last. We have a technological life, department's experience with different component parts, availability, and cost. So most recently, because of the pandemic, the supply chain has severely impacted the apparatus industry, where they're lucky to get parts in for certain components so they can keep building new apparatus. Most recently, a lot of issues with DEF, diesel exhaust fluid components, and if you have a unit that's out of service because of a bad sensor in a DEF unit, you call up your local service supplier and he says, well, I don't have any on the shelf, and you're like, okay, well, so you can get it for me next week? No, he's going to tell you there's a 10 to 12 week lead time. So now if that unit's out of service for 10 or 12 weeks because you can't get a particular part, it goes back to how many reserves do you have, and at some point, the old adage is it's all fun and games until you get 4 or 5 people to show up, the brothers and sisters to go to work that day on the rig, and there's nothing for them to ride on. Finally, the economic life. At what point, this is something that the fire service really, with few examples here, really doesn't take into consideration. We tend to just say, well, we're going to run the unit for 15 years. If it starts eating us out of house and home, we'll try to replace it early. If not, when it leaves our fleet, it sometimes pains me to see people, they've got units up on some of the different internet websites, and here's a perfectly good unit that would typically maybe get $80,000 to $100,000 of resale value, and people are bidding on it, and it goes out the door at $20,000 or $25,000. If we were running a business, we would want to get a return on our initial investment on that. So the economic life is, at what point are we throwing more money at this unit to keep it on the road and it exceeds what the potential resale value of the vehicle would be? This is particularly endemic on aerial devices, where if your community, to keep any kind of aerial device, and certainly platforms, mid-mount or rear mount, are more expensive than a conventional aerial, but that's going to cost you anywhere between $12,000 to $20,000 a year in maintenance, PM, repair, and testing to keep that on the road. If you have an 8-year-old unit, aerial device, and all of a sudden something happens with the engine, and now you need to do an in-frame rebuild of that unit, and that costs another $60,000 or $70,000, well, that might cause you to adjust your planned service life, because at this point now, at some point, you may potentially be throwing the old adage, good money after bad, and the unit's not just going to be able to hold up to do what you want to do.
Currently, Tom, working with a department that has an older, late 80s, early 90s engine that has had a motor malfunction, and they're looking at an inline, but what the estimates are probably between that $20,000 to $30,000 mark. And again, is it worth to put that money in the expected lifespan of that vehicle? And really, that vehicle's probably at the end of its lifespan. Well, it looks nice and has a lot of attachment for the company and the department. Is that, they're trying to wrestle with exactly right now. Will they ever see that, even if they resell that vehicle later on? At what point do you fold it?
Yeah. Chief, you're right. There's a couple of departments in New York that have, one that's kind of a somewhat tragic scenario, have a brand new aerial unit on order, but it's not going to be completed for 18 months. They recently, I get a call from the fire commissioner, quote, we blew the engine in the 1995 rig. What are they going to do with it? All right, if they go to put a rebuilt motor in the unit, they're not going to get the value even of that back out of the unit. If you look at some of the used fire truck sites, particularly the nationally recognized folks, you'll see in a couple of cases the people will say if they're buying your used unit, they're not interested in anything older than 2000. And it's not because there was anything magic that happened in 2000 that didn't happen in 1999, but from the potential resale value, while I would look, Chief Baldwin and Tom Sham would look at a 1975 vehicle and think, hey, we can remember riding on that kind of rig. That's a 45-year-old ride, all right? A 2000 rig that's going to go to a smaller, lower run department, that's still a 20 or 21-year-old vehicle. So it goes back to the life cycle. How long do we expect these units to run? From the technology standpoint, there's a lot of electronics on units that started appearing around 1995. So if you have a 15-year-old aerial device, for example, that had electronic controls on the aerial, and you need to get that screen replaced, it's going to be very costly, and it's going to take a long time to show up. So we need to really think about a combination of how long you would like the vehicle to last, and from a pragmatic standpoint, at which point are we throwing good money after bad on this unit?
Well, you really kind of jump back a minute too. We're talking about the reserve apparatus. Over the years, some of the departments I've been involved with, every station had a second or third engine as a reserve apparatus. The specialists maybe not, but the pumpers they did. At what point can you no longer support that to have, what are some of the concepts of having reserve apparatus? One department, the department I grew up in, had 3 stations. Each station had 2 engines. So the idea was the second engine was a reserve piece, didn't run a whole lot. After a while, those companies worked with the municipality because of the price increases have gone to one reserve piece that is the newer of the apparatus rotating out, the older apparatus rotating out for a frontline reserve and shared between the companies. And maybe that's something that people need to, we need to look at on a regional basis, talk about the older pieces, what the breaking point is. Should we be looking, can we work out something with the regional partners maybe to have some reserves on a regional level, even if it's different jurisdictions, as opposed to trying to do everything and putting good money after bad and not seeing that return? I don't know if that really...
No, Chief, if you look at it in Maryland, so the larger counties where they have a county-wide fire department with a county-wide purchased fleet, even though there might be some volunteer units in there, those counties, larger counties, have a fairly healthy reserve system. You go take it in St. Mary's or Charles County, for example, where each station through county funding buys their own rigs, but there are no county-wide reserve units. So if a couple of units happen to go out of service back to back, the stations, have agreements that they'll try to borrow a rig from someone, at least to keep for example, keep an engine company in service. Since there's no stations that typically have 2 aerial devices or 2 special services in terms of a heavy squad. When that goes out, you have to hope that maybe your secondary station is running a rescue engine, and if they weren't on the assignment, you get them on the assignment.
We kind of what you were talking about. When I was in Chambersburg, we had a tower, and when the tower went down, we made the arrangement with one of the Navy volunteer companies that we would send one of our apparatus driver for the truck would go to their station, was trained on their apparatus and operate their truck. They would staff it with volunteer house. They would staff it with our driver, at least to keep an aerial device in service in the region. It's just some things that are out of the box thinking like that stuff.
Really good point. So that's why you say that while there's obviously a lot of individual station pride in terms of how their apparatus is designed, and in many cases, what their favorite brand is, if your next due company, to go to that point, they need to be able to train how to operate. If you, for example, have a mid-mount tower ladder and all your people are turned over on that, but the next due station runs a rear mount aerial and it's a different manufacturer, well, you can say, well, I can maybe, I can drive it and get it there, but how good are you going to be able to position and spot the unit, because it just operates and operationally has different features that the mid-mount doesn't have. So I want to talk a little bit about apparatus weights. This, unfortunately, is one of the things that we in the fire service have tried to bury. As you whistle, as you go past the cemetery, you kind of pretend it really didn't happen to you. But it's highly recommended that anytime you're even going to propose to buy a new apparatus, that you require the unit that your favorite vendor or the prospective vendors are going to supply a weight analysis, which is some engineering calculations to show that what they're proposing with the front axle and rear axle, it's going to hold up. As you're going to see in a couple of minutes, you'll see what the NFPA minimum weights are. But as a case study that Chief and I were involved in with the department in Virginia, that we had them weigh all the equipment that was on their single axle 75-foot aerial device. The NFPA minimum for equipment would have been 2,500 pounds. Well, after we weighed everything, found out what the existing truck carried was just shy of 3,400 pounds because it carried extrication equipment and a bunch of other stuff. So when we went to go to bid in a proposal, we wanted each vendor to supply a weight analysis and have it based on a minimum of 3,500 pounds. Well, we got a couple of questions back from the vendors saying, well, you realize that the NFPA says it's only 2,500. Yeah, we realize that, but that would be no different than I'd like to think that for my age and height, Tom Shan should weigh this. Well, when I go to my doctor, the first thing the nurse does is put me on the scale, and I'll joke and say, I already know what the number's going to be, and you're not going to like it. I weigh more than I should. Right? Well, fire trucks are exactly the same way. And it's not important until it's important when you get involved in an accident. The first thing that's going to happen is they're going to impound the vehicle and weigh it. So you should require this on each new apparatus as well as weigh each vehicle annually. So this is the chart, and this has been in existence for a number of years. Since 2009, whether you're going to buy a pumper, a rescue engine, a rescue wagon, any kind of tanker, initial attack vehicle aerial, those are the weights the minimum weights that are listed in the NFPA 1901. It's the responsibility of the fire department, of the authority having jurisdiction to tell the vendor, this is how much weight I'm going to carry. And failing that, the manufacturers are going to defer to this number, which again is the minimum. And that may or may not work for you. 2,000 pounds on a pumper, exclusive of the ground ladders, the hooks, and the hose load, that would probably work. On a rescue engine, 2,500 pounds is generally well under what is needed, and the majority of the aerial apparatus, particularly if it's a straight truck, not a Quint, is going to carry a lot more than 2,500 pounds. So for a number of years, the NFPA, the 1911 standard, this is vitally important, regardless of the age of your vehicle, who built it, or how you're using it. Annually, it needs to go to certified scales, have the front axle weighed without personnel, rear axle separately, and then the total gross vehicle weight rating. You take those numbers and balance it out. Here's two examples with two different manufacturers. The tags will be somewhere inside the cab in the driver's compartment, maybe on the door, on the side of the engine box, sometimes stuff on older units behind the driver's seat, so it's tough to find, but it will tell you what the original ratings are. If you don't have that information, you want to get it, record it, and without fail, weigh every vehicle in your fleet. For what it's worth, with some of the work that we've done with emergency vehicle response prior to the pandemic, because this type of work ceased because of their ability to travel, but in the preceding 18 months, we ran the stats, and 34% of the vehicles that we looked at, regardless of type, make, manufacturer, color, were overweight on the front or the rear axle, and in several cases, they were overweight on the front with no one in the cab. So we, in general, have not done a good job of policing ourselves with respect to overweight conditions on our apparatus. So why are they important? Because whether you get cut off at the intersection and you end up sticking the front end of your engine into a building, all right, or you flip it on the road in wet road conditions, combination of bad conditions, maybe an inexperienced driver or an overweight vehicle. But here's a couple of practical examples. This particular rescue engine was built in the day with 21.5 front axle. Today, that was the heaviest axle available at that point. If that rig was going to be built today, they put a 23,000 pound front axle under it. Well, when we had it scaled, it weighed 21,720 with nobody in the front, and it had seating for 6. The rear axle had a rating of 31,000. You can see what it weighed. The members, as the gentleman was driving the rig out, they said, a couple of guys have been complaining, saying, the rig kind of pulls a little bit, and it's not stopping real well. Well, it's pretty obvious, because even if you had 2 or 3 people on it, it's overweight front and rear and just patently unsafe. an example of someone that tried to save a little money because in this particular village in upstate New York, they couldn't afford the vehicle with some of the features that they wanted. So it was originally bought and designed with a 21.5. Again, heaviest axle available at the time. Today, that device would have a 24,000-pound rear axle on it. It had seating for 8. Well, it weighed within 20 pounds of the front axle weight with no one in the cab, and the rear axle was okay. Well, when it was purchased, the department originally wanted to put a diesel generator and a pair of cable wheels on it. It had to be cut so it could meet the budget, and the vehicle was within 1,000 pounds of the front axle rating at the time of delivery. So the manufacturer of this unit, it didn't pass muster. For each seating position prior to 2009, the NFPA allowed 200 pounds. I would challenge you, next time you were at a drill, at any kind of training session, or even the monthly fire department meeting, scan around the room and see how many folks, if they were agreed to step on a scale, would weigh 200 pounds or less than 200, allowing for PPE and the SCBA. Since 2009, the requirement now, the minimum, is 250 pounds per seat. Again, if you look at the majority of people that I know, you put themselves in PPE and all the equipment that you're going to see in a few minutes that go into the cab, not hard to figure that that 250 really is a minimum, and it's, again, not hard to overload a vehicle no matter what happens. So in later years, after the department got a little bit more money, 2 years after the rig was delivered, they installed the generator and one cable wheel on the front, and now the rig is virtually overloaded with nobody on it. So they kind of created a worse condition than they did, but even with 1,000 pounds of margin on the front axle at the time it was delivered, that unit did not meet the intent of 1901, but no one unfortunately thought to weigh the unit. So another point, so when you're out on a final inspection, insist that you get a full tank of water. If it's possible, you need to set this up ahead of time. Have the unit weighed up with sandbags, all right, so that you can duplicate the amount of equipment weight you're going to put on it and weigh it. If you can't do that, before you pay for the vehicle and accept it, when it comes into your community, load it up with the hose, with all the equipment, and run it over scales. And two things. Number one, make sure that it meets the front and rear axle loadings, and if you were smart enough to ask for the weight analysis, you can compare it against the weight analysis to make sure that you haven't bought something that is going to prove to be problematic in later years.
I mean, Tom, one of the things we talked about earlier today and previous times we've been together and some of the stuff we've worked on together is how important the weights are in liability. Is it a chief officer, as a department chief over the years, you know, we said earlier this morning even, what you don't know, you don't know. It was always surprising to me, it's scary when you started actually looking at this and weigh your apparatus and working with some other departments and seeing what's out there. And I can remember days growing up in the Pittsburgh area, we refurbed an old Baldwin France pumper in the house, and we put a new tank in it, we did all kinds of stuff to it, and it was all done in the fire station. None of us looked at any of these things. And back then, even the recent study that the department I was involved with, we did, it was kind of shocking as the chief of that agency to realize if we put more than 2 people in a cab with a piece of apparatus, we were over the weight, well over the weight, because of the areas. Support vehicles, we had taken a box truck, converted to a hazmat unit, which we just started putting equipment on. And some other departments involved with, when we're refurbing apparatus, a lot of times we just start to add equipment ourselves, and it's designed for A, we end up doing B with it, but making sure we make those changes around those equipment, we're looking at these tags and these weights, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the department chief and the responsible parties, and also responsible adults in the department, are going to have to face answer questions why we didn't catch this or why this went on.
Yep. In some states, all right, the person driving the vehicle, even if he's a full-time employee, the legalese is that person is actually using his license to validate the fact that he's capable of driving and operating the vehicle. So a number of years ago, there was a big challenge about requiring apparatus drivers, chauffeurs, engineers, whatever the technicians, whatever the term is, to have a CDL. All right, in some states where there was strong volunteer contingent, they fought that to kind of beat that down. Okay, that's fine, but how well are we training our drivers and operators to operate the vehicle that they're assigned to? And then it goes to the point that if you now have to transfer over and you're operating in another unit, is it kind of like what you just came out of, or is it radically different? And how capable is the person behind the wheel to be able to handle that vehicle? You go back to the initial slides, that Ford pumper, if you could drive a car, you could pretty much drive that and stuff it anywhere you need it. You get behind the wheel of a 52,000-pound rig, and there's nothing wrong with the larger unit. It handles and accelerates a lot different, and because of the high horsepower, high torque engines that we're putting in vehicles, they'll go very fast. They don't stop like the car that you responded to the station or showed up to work at 0700 for the beginning of your shift. So overweight apparatus, it's important because when it goes upside down, a lot of people complained about the NFPA requirements to have everything either enclosed in a compartment or in a 9G rated bracket. It's important, right? We go through an intersection and somebody cuts us off, and now you look at the amount of front end damage, and the bumper pretty much came off that rig, and a little bit of cab intrusion with where they hit, where the cab collapsed into the officer's compartment. So back in 2009, prior to that, fire trucks could go as fast as we wanted them to go, right? It would be one of the questions at pre-construction. They'd say, how fast do you want to go? 60, 65, 68. Most tires are speed rated to max out at 75 because that's the application in over-the-road trucks. Well, in 2009, because the preceding years, we jettisoned a lot of tankers and tenders along the way, so the NFPA 1901 committee changes it and says anything over 50,000 pound GVW, so that's any kind just about of tanker, any aerial device, single or tandem axle, and in a lot of cases rescue engines, we're going to limit you folks to 60 miles an hour in an effort to hope that you're going to slow down and you're not going to end up like this. Now that was kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, okay, we're going to force you people to slow down. And Chief, that was the same thing year where they required the seatbelt monitoring system, which, having been in the service like you for a number of years, I found to be somewhat pitiful to think that we couldn't monitor our own good and welfare and say we're not going anywhere until everybody's seated and belted. No, now we had to add a $900 appliance with a little green light or red light to make sure that everybody was buckled up, because we couldn't take care of our own folks.
It's interesting you bring up the seatbelts. Just kind of as a side note, I had somebody send me a message about 2 months ago about the seatbelt warning systems in their agency, that people were getting old seatbelts, and the ones that weren't rated, the weights, they were using just a buckle, putting something on the seatbelt, a dummy buckle they cut out of an old car, maybe an extrication, and slide that in to defeat the system.
It just,
Boggles your mind.
yeah. So you can go faster than that, all right, but you're going to have to sign a waiver. Every manufacturer, if the unit weighs more than 50,000 pounds, they'll say, okay, you want to go faster than that? Sign the waiver. Well, who's responsible for that? And whether you're a small little organization, is it the fire chief? Is it the fire company president? If you're into a county fire department, does the county fire chief waive that and say, yep, we'll go as fast as we want? You need to look at the legal liability there. So from a situational awareness thing, how big do we need to go? If your department has aerial apparatus, you need to be very, beyond being able to fit it to the fire station. You need to be able to make sure that it's going to go everywhere in your response district, including underpasses, if it's a weight-sensitive unit, as any aerial device would be, if you'd have weight-restricted bridges or any other obstruction, you need to think about that as you're purchasing the apparatus. You get to that point, either one of those cases there, that's too little too late with a very expensive repair.
Tom, just with running routes and knowing the district, even when speccing the apparatus out, but changes that can occur in the district, even temporarily. If a bridge is changed or a temporary underpass, overpass situation when construction's going on, is making sure you take a look at those and staying in touch with transportation agencies, because again, it may only be a temporary deal, but you don't want to find out about that temporary deal or, dear chief, at 3 o'clock in the morning when it doesn't fit.
Exactly, Chief. For departments that are doing the responsive apparatus with CAD, where you have AVLs on the unit and they're picking the closest available units, that's one thing. In other cases where it's more run traditionally and they're assuming that you're coming from quarters, but you happen to be out on inspections or doing a drill or any kind of training activity, and you are now arriving at intersections or at the box location and you're out of order because of where you came from. Those are times when you need to think about calling the intersection or advising the units of where you're responding from. So you might be first due on the box, but you're going to end up being third due because you were way out at the end of your response area, or you were doing a drill and you had a line pull that's going to take you a few minutes to rack it up to be able to go.
And somebody's not going to be expecting you to be there.
Right. Best comment for this image is common sense is not so common. If you look at the image on the left, these people did a kind of okay job of mounting some tools and putting them in 9G brackets. Had somebody in the department make these real nice oak boards that were stained, and then they mount some equipment in tulip clips where you're still going to get in trouble. There's one way. If you need to have your forcible entry tools and other things inside the cab, which is fine, all right, they need to be in a secured 9G bracket and make sure that they're mounted to something secure and not just the back wall that had the acoustical matting or the vinyl padding with a small thin backboard, and it's not mounted to something secure within the cab. So when you're speccing a new rig, be prepared that at the pre-construction conference, you're going to spend a lot of time talking about what goes on inside the cab. Dashboard layouts, rocker switch arrangements. Even with multiplex units, you can still do things now through a screen or do them through individual rocker switches. If you're operating a fleet of apparatus, extremely important that they complement one another, and unless there's a complete redesign or you're going to do a wholesale switch of how you lay out the stuff. And that way, if a driver one day he's assigned to engine 2 and he picks up an overtime slot, and now he's working at engine 7, he slides in the front seat of that, and it looks the same. It doesn't have to retrain himself and reduces the opportunity for operator error. Unfortunately, because we use these units and the excuse used to be used and abused, I wish I could tell you that I made these images up, but things that we've come across. Very common, you have a seat belt, the retractor mechanism is somewhat worn, it's hanging down, gets chewed up in the nadir pin. You look at that driver's seat, and whether it was made out of Cordura material or vinyl, we just beat it up and then we don't do anything to fix it. The step area inside, on the other area, they had worn out the aluminum tread plates, and now it's just smooth aluminum. So not a non-slip surface by any stretch of the imagination. We understand that some companies are busier than others, and at times, after the third or fourth run, and it's 0900 in the morning, and you haven't had your second cup of coffee yet, you just start throwing the tools in there and like, okay, I don't want to put them back in the brackets. Either one of those cases, not really completely safe, particularly having your irons just sitting on the cab floor, waiting that if something happens and you get involved in an accident, that's going to come up and create some mechanism of injury that you're going to be tough to try to explain that one to your chief. We use our apparatus in all different kinds of conditions. Maryland is less susceptible to having snow and ice conditions than a lot of other areas, except when you get up in the far rural areas up in Garrett and Allegheny County where they get a fair amount of snow. But we operate rigs in all kinds of conditions. We can't always tell Mrs. Smith that we'd like to have a nice dry road. So you look at when you slide off the road with your rig, or that's a unit actually going out on a run in New Jersey, taking in an automatic alarm. They ended up taking out the motor and a bunch of electronic appliances on that Fire trucks are not designed to operate underwater. There's been a couple of articles recently in trade journals talking about departments, Chief, I think it was one down in Texas, that designed all their engine companies to operate in high water because their community was very prone to flooding. So you have to look at where your air intake and your air cleaner mechanism is on your rig. And if it's down low, down in front, and a lot of rigs typically down on the right side, underneath the officer seat in the cab, that's not designed to run, when you can no longer see the top of the tires on the rig, you're going to destroy the rig and take it out. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about stepping surfaces. For a number of years, the NFPA has required non-slip surfaces, tread plate, that typically has little raised diamonds that has little groove marks in them. And that's okay, but again, that's the minimum. Different examples of open grip steps. It's Morton cast material that's shown on the right side that have an aggressive stepping surfaces. The number one injury on fire apparatus is not going into an intersection and meeting Mrs. Smith in her smart car and taking her out. It slips, falls, sprains, and strains operating on or about the rig. So you need to look at your rig when you're designing it and say, okay, obviously getting in and out of the cab, driver and officer, in and out of the cab in the crew area, particularly if you're going to mount hand tools in there. What's the 3 points of contact you expect your people to maintain so they can safely egress off the rig and not get hurt? More importantly, off the back steps. So again, other examples of open grip strut steps. If you look at that particular cab design with the narrow, because they wanted a real short cab, you look at that step, you're not going to be able to see that coming out of the cab if you're facing the street side. You're going to have to back out of that cab and hope that you hit those two small little steps. So again, there's examples of, does it meet the NFPA 1901? Yes. The 1901 has a minimum square inch area of the step surface. That meets it. But if I've got a choice of getting in and out of the cab on the image on the left versus the one on the right, I know which one I'm going for. People that are enamored with top mount pumps, right, where you have a walkway, you can see the example there is the NFPA has height restrictions from the ground to the first step, anywhere around the vehicle, whether it's an engine, a rescue engine, or any kind of truck, can't exceed 28 inches, 24 inches. From there to any other point on the vehicle, the steps have to be on 18-inch centers. So if you look at the example on the left, they had the step, they had that little compartment underneath the walkway for the top mount pump, and now you have to have a little fold down step because the height of that compartment was 24 inches, so they needed to have that step there. The step surface on the other image is busted, it's open grading, so if you get in an area where you get snow and ice buildup, that's a very aggressive stepping surface, non-slip. Snow and ice will fall through that rather than build up on the tread plate and eventually ice over.
Yeah, Tom, one thing with the steps that you're talking about is, again, we're designing apparatus and even evaluating our current apparatus. It's one thing to look at them at the show floor someplace, and I know you'll agree with this, it's one thing to look at them on the show floor, the drawings, and look at some other people's apparatus, but to actually have somebody climb up to some of the top mount pumps, or get to the top of the dunnage area, or the back of the hose bed, wearing a pair of bunker pants and some gear, because those time we're at the shows, we're climbing up in this stuff, wearing shorts, tennis shoes, t-shirts, not in PPE. It changes that whole dynamic.
Right. This is probably one of the areas that when you're designing a new vehicle or looking at your current fleet, again, this is where the NFPA says you have the step requirements of 24 inches and then 18 inches, that anything above that then needs to be illuminated and that has to have a handhold. That's why you'll note in these pictures that the folding steps are open, all right, because it does two things. It's supposed to be the stepping surface, and as you're walking up, you put your gloved hand through that. And as the chief alluded, you look at these, and they're NFPA 1901, they're street legal, right? Why you would want to design something and have your hose bed up 80 inches in the air, I'm not sure. but you're going to climb 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps after you get on the rear step to get up to the top of that rig to flip up the tread plate hose bed cover when you go, rack your attack line.
Even with the master stream device, and a few engines that I've been involved with, it looked real good in concept, or when we were doing at the factory acceptance, the steps to get up, they put the master stream device in operation. But when I'm that guy at 3 o'clock in the morning, probably don't have that CAB on my back, but I'm coming out of the engine or on the wagon drive, or at least with some gear on, scurrying, I need to be able to scurry up real quick to put that thing in operation. And if I've got to cross step 3 times to get up to the dunny to put that thing in operation, I've defeated the purpose. I've lost all my time and ability to deploy something quickly.
Chief, you're on point again. It's very common at shows. I will look at something like that and I'll try to climb up that with my advanced age and say, can I do it in street clothes, right? And if you have to kind of hunt and peck for the steps going up when you can see what you're doing, no matter how well the steps are illuminated, something like that, it's patently unsafe. So how do we get here, right? The two differences between look at a late 70s vintage, pumper back in the day that had a 750-gallon water tank and a fairly low hose bed, and no disrespect, I mean, you look at, so what have we done? So that same 750-gallon tank, but now we needed more compartment space, we needed a bigger rear compartment, we went from a traditional T tank possibly to a rectangular tank, and everything got bigger. As it gets bigger, it also gets heavier. And that's why, once again, why the weight analysis is so critically important. So really pay attention. If you're designing an engine, look at what the dimension is from the ground to the bottom of the hose bed. If your department is running cross lays, do the same thing. Look and evaluate how the pump panel's laid out and get your attack lines down as low as possible. And in both examples here, the one on the left with a PG County engine, where they've got fixed corner steps. They're not relying upon folding steps of something that you have to physically go down. It's safe access, it's a low hose bed and safe access into the hose bed. The example on the right from Syracuse, New York, where they've got, once again, fixed steps, how to get into the hose bed. At some point, if you're in an active engine company, you're going to be laying a supply line, pulling an attack line, and you're going to have to rack it. And safe access in there so you can rack it, get it in the right way, and be able to put yourself, the company, back in service. Really important.
And when you're talking, Tom, you're talking more about the hose bed accesses, but we're looking at, people tend to do away with that whole tailboard or shorten it up, because we're not riding people in the back anymore like back in the day. But in reality, again, your comment, when we're pulling those lines and repacking them, having that tailboard, just as important to pull those lines, to get up there, get the lines off properly, to pull them off and then safely repack them.
Right.
We've kind of defeated the purpose, or cutting ourselves short operationally on some things,
Right.
by eliminating that.
So the image on the left, you see, has the traditional beaver tail panels, and it has safe access to get up into the hose bed on that Hollywood engine 72. Because, as Chief alluded, that in a lot of cases, two manufacturers refer to the back of the pumpers now as square back design. Whenever I see that, it scares me. It means, okay, square back means you've maximized the length of the body, and we've sacrificed what? The depth of the rear step, so we end up having to use a little ladder assembly, which is still better than a folding ladder to get back up in there. But two examples, right? A ladder that you climb to the top on the left side there, and you get up onto the top tread plate deck, and you're doing what? You're now looking for another handrail or something to hang on to peel back the hose bed cover, or the image on the right, we're using that access ladder with the short rear step that, again, it forces you to have to climb up onto the rig to be able to rack the supply line. So when you're writing specs, you're out to do mid-inspections or final inspections. Don't expect your apparatus manufacturer to read your mind and is going to do everything that the specifications may detail. The example on the left, a chassis with that front bumper extension, once the body got installed, found out that the front axle was going to be overloaded and it had to be modified. This particular department specified galvanized hot dip frame rails and have all of the different components finish painted underneath because of the extreme weather and salt conditions they have. Well, there's the shot, there's the hydraulic pump to run the generator and the part of the rescue tool system, and that was all rusted up and mounted in there and was not finished painted. So these are the kinds of things you need to look for as you're doing your inspections. One of the banks had a really great expression that caught on. It said, "What's in your wallet?" All right, I think good friend Billy Goldfeder spun that to who's in your wallet. Who do you like and who do you love? Well, if you love your wife, your kids, your family, your grandkids, all right, what's behind your front bumper, right? If you do this job long enough, at some point, you're either going to drive, be riding on, hopefully not be the officer that's going to have to write the accident report, that when you go to customize something, you look at the example on the left-hand side, and we're not demeaning that manufacturer, they supplied what was asked. The traditional 10-inch or 12-inch stainless steel bumper, you get involved in any kind of accident, the bumper rolls up because it's supported at the outboard part of where the frame rail extension is, comes into the cab, and that's not something that, as they joke, Chief, we think that it's going to buff out. If it's on the opposite side, where we tend to put the federal mechanical siren, the siren gets whacked and that gets pushed up into the cab, so we just added another $3,500 component to the damage bill. So when the rig encounters something that you don't want it to encounter, a steel painted reinforced bumper, the heaviest bumper that your manufacturer can offer, that's where you want to go. If you want to stay because you want the pretty appearance of the stainless steel bumper, then you require that that be put with either a 3/8 or quarter full width steel reinforcement, and bring it, wrap it back around the corner and support it back to the frame rail extension. Two examples, if you don't ask what you're going to get, the left-hand side, even though that's well set up with double attack lines, that's what you're going to get. It's a bumper backer, but that's not going to help you when you get involved in a front-end accident. And in some jurisdictions, they will use the term cab intrusion, which doesn't mean somebody's coming to steal your fire truck. That means when the front end of your rig collapses and gets into the front of your aluminum cab, and now potentially we're trapping the driver or officer.
Paul, one thing on that other slide with the engine 51, just as a reminder for folks, when we're looking at some of the design stuff on current apparatus, modifying to put bumper trays and those type of things, when we talk about the front bumper, is how far down those items hang. And the bumper's extended down a lot of times to cover that, or you have the diamond plate from the boxes hanging out. But looking at your first two area, and the areas you run even, particularly if you're on interstates, you're going through the median, those type of deals, some rural areas, private lanes, those boxes with the angle of approach and the angle of departure, you're getting hung up and causing additional damage to the front end, particularly if you've got plumbing out front.
Right. You look at any fire truck blueprint by anyone, they'll have these little angles going off to the front and the rear, and it says NFPA minimum is 8 degrees, which is fine. That, again, that's minimum, that's a starting point. We will constantly ask folks during the proposal process, or certainly in pre-construction, say, okay, I see the 8-degree front angle of approach and departure, and that line's like going off into outer space. So what is the actual angle of approach? Well, a couple of manufacturers say, no problem, we'll recalculate that. With one manufacturer that I've dealt with, they said, well, it's going to meet the NFPA minimum. I'm like, well, but what is it actually, all right? Or give me the dimension from the lowest point of the vehicle when it's loaded down to the ground. And if this is very common now on rescue engines, where people say, your engines all have 18-inch bumper extensions. You've got a front sleeve and a hose well for 100 feet of hose. We're doing a rescue engine, and I want to put a reel up there or the rescue tool compartment, and I've now got a 20, like that image you saw earlier. I got a 30-inch bumper extension. Do you have anything else in your fleet that has a 30-inch extension? No. Well, let's find out what that dimension is. And you might have to mock something up and go around the response area and find out. A number of years ago, there was a department that I was working with that wanted an underbody compartment. Never had it before, claimed, all right, what they wanted to put in there. So we sized the underbody compartment for all the neat stuff they wanted to carry. I think it was the 3rd week of operation. They're out driver training at night. On a Tuesday night, I get a phone call on Wednesday morning saying, hey Tom, you know that trim plate box that we built? Guess what? It's sitting in the middle of Route 59. We cleared it off last night because you were right. we made the thing too big. Well, too little, too late.
And that kind of, looking at it with the bumper and the structure, if you're doing those modifications, you want to carry a lot of the stuff up front, making sure it doesn't hinder the integrity or the strength of that front bumper.
Right. So here's an example. This is what a front bumper extension looks like before it gets built up, but you can see the reinforcement where it goes back to the center part of the frame. That's what you want to do. Right. So with aerial devices, spend a few minutes on those. All right. Over the years, back in the day when Chief Baldwin and I started, there were 4 choices of aerial ladder lengths: 65, 75, 85, and 100. It was pretty easy to remember. When a couple of companies developed a new design device, they had a 110 foot, which was well accepted in the fire service. So what does your community need? Are you buying it because you needed the vertical reach because of the height of your buildings, or is it because of setbacks and you need more horizontal reach? And based on the outrigger stance and how big your vehicle is, it goes back to our very first point, that's going to determine how much turf you need to be able to set that up on the fire ground.
It really, operational, knowing the needs of your community and matching that with that device, having the right device, knowing the true reach, the horizontal true reach, the jack spread setup, those type of things, the weight, the angle departure, things we talked about, being able to get the apparatus around the community based on your needs.
The outrigger stance on aerial devices today can go from as little as 12 feet on a 100 or 105 foot rear mount ladder with a 500 pound tip load. On some certain platforms requires a 20 foot stance on the outriggers. So what does your response area look like?
And Tom, you talked about tip loads, and I know you're going to get to that in a minute, but truly, when you talk about cost, needs, in the community, be realistic of what your tip loads are. What your needs are going to be, what you're hanging off the front. We'll get to that in a minute, but.
Yeah, prior to 1991, there wasn't a tip load requirement. You could build it to whatever you want. You probably remember as well as I did, coming from Western Pennsylvania, awful lot of one particular brand that if the unit was extended out horizontally and you went to raise it, you were having a great day with nobody on the tip. In some cases, it wouldn't lift itself. So now we have minimum requirements, and that's great stuff that's in the NFPA requirements. So what do we need? In both cases here, we need horizontal reach based on the layout of where the buildings were. One of Mike Wilbur's famous statements is, the good Lord didn't put asphalt 360 degrees around every building in your response district. So you take the typical garden apartment, townhouse, condominium complex, you add where everybody parks their vehicles, what the setbacks are, and we're left in the fire service to deal with what we've got to do. That image on the right, just fantastic. You can see somebody had to pull a 600 foot attack line to get into the building. Guess what? We had to be able to do what we could do to be able to get the aerial up on the roof. So one of the things that I think the NFPA has done a disservice to us, again, because of this minimum requirement on a Quint, we only now need 85 feet of ladders. Been that way for a number of years. If you think that your standard pumper carries 48 feet of ladders, and if we're looking at the dollar value, let's suppose you bought a bargain pumper for $600,000 and you put the standard 14 roof, 24 foot extension, 10 foot folding on there, all right? We then went out and bought a $1.2 million Quint, double the price, and we get 85 feet, all right? If you want to carry 85 feet of ladders, you should do probably what the Chief's vehicle down here in Stafford County. You buy an F-Ford 250 pickup, you put a rack on it, and you throw the ladders on top. That's a lot better use of the public money than taking $1.2 million and showing up with one ladder that's longer than anything else that an engine company is going to show up with. And if it's a standard truck, okay, non-Quint, it's only 115 feet. Why do we do that? Because unfortunately, single axle, tandem axle Quints in many communities are more common than a straight ladder, whether it's a rear mount or tower. Tillers, even folks out on the West Coast are buying, as they call them, quillers, because they have a pump and tank on it. So you want to think about what no different than an engine company. What length of tack lines and what do I need to be able to carry to meet the objectives in my response area? Same thing with your ladder truck. You're buying it because they call it that, a ladder truck. I'm not interested in something that carries more hose and everything else. And you look in this case, We got a rack of 3-inch, we got some old-fashioned D hooks, and we got whole pipe poles. So everybody comes off, the truck's got their own pipe pole, but we only got one 35-foot ladder to throw. So if you can't access more than 2 sides of the building with your aerial device, you better hope Mrs. Smith, or more importantly, if one of our brothers or sisters get jammed up on the 3rd floor and they need to bail, that 35-foot ladder went there, because there's only one showing up unless you got a better equipped ladder truck. That looks something like this, all right? Carefully look at and evaluate what ground ladders you need, and don't ever, please, let a potential apparatus salesperson come into your station and say, well, the minimum is this, and we can do that.
As much as we talk about horizontal reach and the jack spreads and setups with the aerial device, when the truck coming in, the ground ladder is just as important. More is better. Having what's right for your community, looking at your community and looking at, maybe there's 2 in the front but 3 in the rear, guard departments, what your needs are, what your exposures are. In all, some of the projects I've been involved in the departments, always the discussions, we don't have enough people to throw those ground ladders. Maybe not arriving on the apparatus initially, but as additional companies come, additional personnel show up. Again, making sure all sides of that building are ladder, not only for the occupant safety, but ours, but again, having them there and available.
Absolutely, Chief. As a probie, I was learned, you keep throwing ladders until one of 2 things happen. All sides and all elevations, or you run out of ladders to throw, all right? And
Exactly.
If you threw all the ladders on your piece, you look for anything else that's on a fire ground and still got them, and throw them. Because they're there for our safety, all right? You look at the case here, right? They stretched an attack line up to the 3rd floor because they didn't want it. They're on the C side of the building. The front stairwell was already jammed up, and those gentlemen there have done the search on the fire floor, and they're bailing out. If that ladder wasn't there, it's great that we've all been trained into different bailout techniques. It's a lot safer and on us to be able to have the ladder to be able to get in and out. So different examples. It's not that we're anti-Quint, but you have to think of the application. In the case of Kittery Point, Maine, it worked out well because of their response district and their needs. In the case of that Mammoth Lakes, California unit, it's an extremely impressive rear mount unit. And the gentleman, and including the chief, said, well, we use that about 3 or 4 months a year. That rig is too big to get around. Mammoth Lakes gets something north of 400 inches of snow annually. They said, we can't get that rig around. So it's a great looking aerial device, but that it works, for a small part of your district. No matter what you do, all right, your apparatus cannot replace staffing, as the chief alluded to, all right. You might have more ladders than your 3 or 4 personnel can throw, all right? But it's those ladies and gentlemen that make the show go when we arrive there. So if we got them there safely on well-designed, mission-efficient apparatus and get them home safely, that's a home run. But you can't take a pumper and turn it into a rescue engine. You can't take a traditional ladder truck and turn it into a Quint and have the same number of personnel assigned and just think that everything's going to happen.
I always refer to that, Tom, as kind of the Swiss Army knife theory. But reality is you can do everything with the Swiss Army knife, but you can only do one thing at a time with the Swiss Army knife and do it well.
Right. Particularly with any kind of Quint aerial device, depending on your order of response and your staffing levels. It's when you show up based on your SOGs, are you operating as an engine, you operating as a truck, or are you going to try to just wing it and take the 4 personnel and split up and do whatever you can. So we need to, again, concentrate on designing apparatus that meet the mission of the response district. If you find out in looking at your fleet that you don't have the proper ground ladder complement, chances are you can't change it or replace it. So then you find out where the nearest truck company is that's got the equipment and the ground ladder complement that you need, and get them on the running assignment. What's in your maintenance shop? As we alluded to about taking about frontline rigs and what happens when the rig goes in for preventative maintenance, if it has to go out to your vendor for warranty work, what kind of shape does that leave you in? Depending on the size of your fleet, how many units can you afford to rotate and have out of service? In some departments now, because of the amount of downtime that we'll talk about. It's limited training. He said we can't have a company out at the training academy today because we need to transfer them to cover in an area because 2 units unexpectedly are out of service and we've run out of reserve units. So, well, sometimes we as the responders and staffing levels on the apparatus kind of look at the maintenance folks as like, they want to take my rig to do whatever. Having that unit and keeping it as one of the truck companies, commercial chassis companies talk about is uptime. The amount of time that you can get in your vehicle, and if you're a commercial truck enterprise, whether you're hauling, materials, you're working for UPS, you have your own company, and you have 3 vehicles and 3 people assigned to them, you need to have those units available to you and not tied up doing warranty work.
With the apparatus maintenance, and another thing to look at and remember is, are we doing preventative maintenance? Are we doing, I want to say predictive maintenance or proactive maintenance? Or is it reactionary maintenance? What are we doing maintenance-wise? We're doing the annual because we said we're going to spend $10,000 a year on apparatus maintenance, and that's all we spent. And we're doing the minimum required state inspections, those type of things, the oil changes. Or are we being proactive and having a regular PM programs, but and regular annual services, and the apparatus can looked at and cycled through for maintenance before a problem develops, or we're just waiting for those problems to develop?
Right. Excellent point. So Chief Baldwin and I can't answer these benchmarks, but these are things you want to be considering. What's your department's goal for in-service time? All right. Nationally accepted standard, say, is 90%. People would be like, I can recall back to my college days, there's darn few classes that I aced and got a 90 in as compared to a B or a B plus. But think about this, 90%, that means you're willing to write off 10% of the time. So you look at it particularly in a month, okay? I got a 30-day period, 3 days a month, that rig's unavailable to me. You stretch that over the course of a year and say, all right, that unit's unavailable. This type of drill then tells you, well, here's how many, based on the size of your fleet, here's how many reserve units I have, because this goes to your point, Chief, this is expected, out of service time because of preventative maintenance that we're going to do. How do you track it? How do you track your maintenance, repairs, and warranty service? If we're trying to develop a maintenance history on a vehicle, how are those records kept? Many communities, because of the size they have, it can range everything from, well, we got the receipt from the vendor and it got filed into the billing for that month because we paid for that back in January. In other cases, it's all tracked on an electronic system. But if we have continual repetitive warranty issues, how can we identify that on any particular unit? We want to be able to have a very healthy relationship with our warranty service provider, all right? But if you have repetitive issues on a particular component or with a manufacturer in one particular area, that helps you determine, well, here's the kind of warranties I should be asking for, again, and not just accept the standard. So each one of these bullets are really important for your department individually, whether you are responsible as a station for your apparatus maintenance or it goes out to a county facility to be able to track and record this. As you look at vehicles, rust and corrosion, right behind weight, is our #1 enemy on fire apparatus. The state of Maryland is fortunate that as compared to where Chief Baldwin and I came from, gets relatively little snow, once again, as compared to you get up to the counties in western Maryland. But rust and corrosion on air tanks, on fuel tanks. So a number of years ago, I asked, and we were requiring that people put stainless steel fuel tank straps on the rigs because where they would fail, and it would be a deeply religious experience as you turn left with the vehicle to see your 75-gallon diesel fuel tank slide through the intersection and then hit Mrs. Smith's car. And at the time we're told, well, that's unnecessary. It's an unnecessary expense. How much is it? $250. So we paid the $250. By the time we went to pre-construction, said the manufacturer is now offering stainless steel fuel tank straps as standard. So think about where you have areas. Get underneath your rigs, all right? Every fire station should have a creeper. If you don't, go buy one. Get underneath the rig, get your technicians, your chief engineer to get underneath the rigs and check out and see what's happening there. If you've got a double frame rail rig and you're getting frame jacking that's caused due to corrosion and lack of maintenance in some cases. That needs to get identified and get fixed while you can still fix it.
It's important to get underneath the rigs, Tom, as you said. I mean, even from a chief officer standpoint, as a department chief, every once in a while, it probably wouldn't hurt you to put a t-shirt on, get out of the white shirt, just so you can see what your fleet looks like from the underside. Everything may be shiny up top, but it's a disaster underneath.
Yeah, in some jurisdictions, people take a lot of great care and pride in their apparatus, on the top side as well as the bottom side. Unfortunately, most of my practical experience has been the top side might look really good, and when you get underneath or start looking at tires, right? Tires by DOT guidelines have to be replaced at 7 years. How do you tell the age of your tire? You look at the serial number on the tire, and 2905 tells you that that tire was built in the 29th week in 2005. We've seen vehicles that were 15 years old and still had original tires on them. People say, well, the tread depth looks okay. The old, put the Lincoln penny in there and it's fine. Doesn't work. You need to be able to keep up on those kinds of things. Look at your rigs, all right? That's an SCBA compartment door, it's a vendor component. That's what it looked like after 20 months in an upstate New York department, because it was poorly designed and constructed. It's cheap, but it would have been much better off with requiring a stainless steel hinged door. That slide tray photo on the right, it's a steel mechanism. It was an aluminum body, but that's what it looked like after 2 years, because the gasket material on the roll-up door had worn out, and you got salt and corrosion intrusion in there, and everything's rusting. That's what the gasket looks like. The gaskets on roll-up doors are fine, but they require maintenance. They need to be adjusted and lubricated, all right? And when you don't have that seal that's already shredded there, that's another example. Then you just get dirt and intrusion into the compartment, and you wonder why your rescue tools or whatever you're carrying in there looks like heck. Aerial apparatus needs to be inspected annually by a nationally recognized company, all right? There's all kinds of aerial testing companies out there. Some people do a great job and follow all the requirements that are in 1911. Others don't do such a great job. So that example photo on the right was one that had recently passed from a testing company and had numerous other issues, including heavy rust and corrosion issues, yet those people had issued a certificate of compliance and said, keep running this, you're good for another year. Why is preventative maintenance important? Because sometimes it goes beyond tragic, all right? Lieutenant Kelly gave his life in Boston because of failure of brakes of that rear mount ladder and went into a building and killed himself, all right? Not of his own volition, just the lack of maintenance, all right, that hopefully has been addressed. The tire and wheel assembly came off that engine because the lug nuts weren't torqued. The unit was new. Everybody thought, well, it's brand new, doesn't need any maintenance, right? It had been delivered across the country, and wheel and tire come off, and with somewhat dramatic results.
You talking about the maintenance and even just looking at it, the inspections, the things you think about over the years. I worked for a small department as an apparatus driver through college, and I never understood why the chief had us. He was always, you brought the rig back and got washed. And that included climbing underneath with the hose and washing off the frame and everything else. But his point was, if you were looking at that, you're climbing underneath there, you wash the thing on a regular basis. When you came on shift, check the apparatus. You checked the apparatus, you washed it, you did that stuff. And then for an 8-hour shift, it would take probably 2 hours to do 3 pieces, or maybe longer, depending on what we're doing. But you were looking at the rig and looking at stuff. The one aerial shot, when you were talking about the aerial testing, again, that's where it was on an in-service vehicle. So when people are looking at apparatus, pay detail. I guess my point is pay attention to detail, looking at the rigs. And it may seem like tedious work at times to wipe stuff down and wash it and climb under the rig. But you're looking underneath, you're seeing those things, which just not walking and throwing your gear on and walking away from it until you start it. And then you have to run the call with it.
It's always easy to take the old clipboard and people would say, well, we're going to pencil whip the inspection thing.
Right.
The the driver would be out to do the daily checkout on the rig and would be back into the day room drinking his coffee in 10 minutes. Well, you know nothing really got checked.
As a 20-year-old something, I was like, why am I doing this? Why am I washing the frame rails out, climbing underneath these pieces? But, you know, you change your views throughout your career, you get it, you know.
For the last, well, prior to the pandemic, all right, final inspections were exactly that. They were done in person at the factory. All right, with the pandemic, it caused, with no travel being allowed in virtually a lot of jurisdictions, required virtual inspections to be done. These were examples of things that were identified during the process of a pumper inspection. Tilt the cab up of areas where the line wasn't secured, it was chafed. Image over on the right, they did a great job. They had the heat wrap around the wiring harness, but then unfortunately held the heat wrap together with plastic wire ties. So if your department is in the process of accepting at some point within the next 6 to 12 months a new fire truck, Chief Baldwin and I would highly recommend that you do a final, thorough, in-person inspection at the place of the manufacturer. Virtual inspections are exactly that. They're virtual, and you may catch some things and you may not. On most of the ones that I was familiar with, we'd identify anywhere between 24 to 36 items just based on looking at a picture. And that is not representative of being able to go out there to do it in person and to operationally test the rig, to road test it, to pump test it, and to do everything else. Right? Other examples where there's an image on the left, a 2-inch discharge going up to a chick sand swivel for a front bumper pre-connect. It's being chafed and resting right up on the front frame extension. The example on the right, just a gazillion wire ties holding that whole electrical harness together, and if a couple of those fail, they're dropping down on the yellow PTO shaft for the hydraulic pump. If you have an aerial device and it has envelope control, have it tested. The example on this particular rear mount ladder image on the left, that's the way it was set up, brand new. This was during final inspection. They said, well, we want to be able to minimize the amount that the aerial needs to be raised out of the cradle before we can rotate. Just it's faster, and in this particular jurisdiction had a lot of overhead lines. That angle that you see on the left just it wasn't going to work. So we requested that the technician come down, and about 20 minutes later he's got his little laptop, and we tune that up, not only with respect to the cradle, but when it's operating down low at 0 or below, so it doesn't encounter any of the doors on the apparatus. Be careful what you do, all right? You can say in the specs that I want to be able to take, on an aerial device, take the master stream device and raise it above the horizontal. Device might be capable of doing that, but most manufacturers have different lengths of these bolt-on extensions on the end of the aerial. Where did that develop? Because prior to that, if you beat up the end of the aerial and you damage it, you're replacing a whole fly section. So now they have these replaceable bolt-on sections, but be careful. If you have a pinnable waterway on the unit, make sure that the amount of extension of that little bolt-on device doesn't limit your ability to be able to take the monitor nozzle and get it above the horizontal. And with all the stuff that we then mount at the tip of the aerial, if you need to be able to get that into a window area, you want to make sure that you haven't had too many obstructions on there that prohibit you from doing it. And at a final inspection, always insist that you're going to pump test it and flow water through the device. So to wrap up, all right, we hope that we hit a number of interesting areas for you folks to consider. For me, because I'm more of an engine guy, that's a great day to be in the engine. You've got a lot of hose, a lot of work. You know that everybody put out max effort to be able to do it. And if you're in the ladder company, you've got that many brothers and sisters to get to the roof. God bless you, man. You're having a great day. You've got A++ staffing in the truck. So think about it. This was one of the greatest slogans that I've ever seen on the side of a fire truck in a small little department on Fire Island, Long Island. It's just common sense and water. If we could distill a lot of the stuff that we do each day when we either come to work or run a call, it's just that simple. And a very, very good close friend, Andy Fredericks, read that quote, right? Where I came from in upstate New York, Tuesday was garbage day. Never saw the garbage guy really get excited when he came around the corner. We had the second house down on the block. He didn't get excited when he saw the trash and the recyclables out there. Expect a fire on every run. I know we are a fire and EMS, a fire rescue and EMS organization, but we need to be on our A game. We're going to have well-designed apparatus, have well-trained people, and expect there to be a fire. Don't think anything less.
Again, I appreciate your time. And this slide kind of really, for Tom and I, wraps everything up and says it all. Remember, check your rig, check the tools, mentor the probie, learn from the senior man, leave the department better than you found it. And you need to love the job. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Contact information, if you have any questions or comments, anything that we can help you with, Chief Baldwin's email and mine, would be happy to assist you anyway. Thank you to all the brothers and sisters who took the time to listen to the program today. Take care and be safe.
California Casualty has been endorsed by the MSFA for 10 years for its auto, home, and renter's insurance. It is our honor and privilege to protect those who protect our communities. Happy 10-year anniversary to the members of MSFA. Thank you for all that you do. For more information about our program, please visit www.calcash.com/MSFA. We look forward to seeing you at various local, county, and state events.